Well, in these days of economic difficulties, it's important to be able to understand what are some of the bywords and the business lingo that you might see in the newspaper if you're looking for a job. So I thought this morning I'd begin by just giving you what is called an employee want ad translation of particular phrases you will see. If you're looking in the employee want ads and it says energetic self-starter, that means you'll be working for commission. If it says entry-level position, it means that you will be paid the lowest wage allowed by law. If it says experience required, it means they need to know that you need to know the first thing about absolutely everything. A fast learner, you will get no training from us. Flexible work hours, you will frequently work long, hard overtime hours and expect not to see your family. Here's one, make an investment in your future. This is a franchise or a pyramid scheme. Management training position. You will be a salesperson with a worldwide territory. Must have reliable transportation. You will be required to break the speed limits. Must be able to lift 50 pounds. We offer no health insurance or chiropractors. Opportunity of a lifetime. You will not find a lower salary for so much work. Quick problem solver. You will work on projects that are backlogged for months and months. Why is it when the boss does something, it's one value, and when the worker does something else, it's another value? For instance, I, the worker, when I take a long time, I'm slow. When my boss takes a long time, he is thorough. When I don't do it, I'm lazy. When my boss doesn't do it, he's just too busy to get to it. When I do it without being told, I'm trying to be smart. When my boss does the same thing, this is initiative. When I please my boss, that's kissing up. When my boss pleases his boss, that's management cooperation. When I do good, my boss never remembers. But when I do wrong, he never forgets. Yes, work and employment is part of life, and these are difficult in economic times. Open up your Bibles with me, if you will, to Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, where Paul uses code words here in this passage. The code words are slaves and masters. Those are code words for employees and owners, or employees and management. You know, in the ancient Near East, more than 1/3 of the population of people, for instance, in Greece or in Italy, were in the category of slaves. You could become a slave through captive of war. If one country conquered another country, then everyone else in that conquered country became a slave. Now, in the times when Paul was writing, the peace of Rome had existed for a good 70-plus years. And so there were not as many slaves by war, although there were some. The majority of people who were slaves because they were born into the household of slaves, or their parents were slaves. But you could also become a slave by bankruptcy. If you went into debt and you couldn't pay your debt, then you became the slave of another person. Or you could be a slave by contracting yourself. In ancient Near Eastern history, you could actually go to somebody and say, I will be your slave for a certain amount of years, for a certain price, and when that time's over, I'm free. So that would qualify many of us as slaves, wouldn't it, today? Very often we find ourselves signing contracts for labor. Greek law had 4 differences between a freed person and a slave. The freed person could represent themselves in legal matters or in courts, where a slave had to have a master do that. Now, it seems to me in a situation like that, actually the slave would probably be better off. It goes back to that old adage, if you represent yourself in court, you've got a fool for a lawyer. So I don't see the advantage there of being free. A freed person, they were not subject to property seizure or to general arrest. A slave, everything that they had belonged to their master, and if their master wanted to take it away from them, they could. Or if they were found out in the market and weren't where they were supposed to be or something, any citizen could put them under arrest. Thirdly, a freed person could earn their own living. They could go into business for themselves. But the unfortunate thing about that was then they had a tyrant for a master. Those of you who have been in business for yourselves know how difficult that can be. A freed person could live and move wherever they desired when a slave was not able to. Paul talks about slavery, but one of the things we need to understand is that the slavery that Paul is talking about is not the slavery of the European experience. And I emphasize the European experience because slavery was a part of America, but it really wasn't America culture that developed it. This was something that was imported from Europe, as well as the slaves, primarily from the African continent. And this passage carries a lot of emotional baggage with it because of the early history of European slavery being brought to America. Let me mention just 4 differences that we have here. First of all, Greco-Roman or ancient Near Eastern slavery had nothing to do with the color of a person's skin. Their ethnic origin was not a factor in their slavery. American slavery was everything to do with ethnic origin or the color of one's skin. In ancient Near Eastern history, it was a product of war, it was a product of financial difficulties, it was a product of a business contract, and had nothing to do with discrimination or segregation. Secondly, freed persons could enter into slavery and then regain their freedom by signing a contract for labor or services. And many free people did that because to have a good master was to have security. It was even to have prosperity. They would sign into slavery contracts with educational clauses. Now, we see that somewhat today in something like our military. You know, they sign up for a certain number of years, they get education, they get training, and they get different opportunities. We wouldn't call that slavery today. They're not paid enough to be classified as slaves. But they do have excellent health benefits and things like that, and wonderful toys to play with, and things like that. But a freed person, they could make a decision. Well, in American slavery, you were a slave usually for life. Thirdly, slaves could become highly trained and educated professionals in ancient Near Eastern history. They were doctors, they were engineers, they were mathematicians, they were scientists, and they were running households. And slaves were something that very often really led society. And they were hired and educated so that they would benefit the master, quite unlike the brutality of American slavery. And fourthly, slaves in ancient Near Eastern history could work for their freedom, and they could become citizens. That was a part of the process. One was not to be a slave forever, and you were always supposed to allow your slave to work through a process of freedom, liberty, and even citizenship. Now, they had some basic principles in order to become a free slave. First of all, you had to be at least 30 plus years old, which meant they wanted to get the best years out of you before they let you go. Not unlike economies today, is it? Secondly, if you were going to get Roman citizenship, you had to be the slave of a Roman citizen. And then thirdly, you had to be released by one of three mechanisms. The first one was called Vindica. In Vindica, this was kind of a make-believe story where the slave would have a friend come to the master. And they would say, "Dear master, my friend was never a slave, but my friend was actually a free person who was brought into slavery against their will and against the law." Now, that could be completely a lie, and usually was. But it was a formality by which then the master would say, "Oh, we've made a mistake. You are free." A second method was that the master would enroll the slave as a citizen. They would take the slave down to what for us would be like the Secretary of State's office and or a Federal Bureau of Immigration, and they would simply say, "This is my slave. I am enrolling them as a Roman citizen." And to be a Roman citizen has great privileges with it. The third way was that the master would set up some kind of a contractual relationship or agreement. This was to motivate the slave to be a good, hard worker. And so you would set up stipulations, and after a certain period of time, if the slave met those, then the master would set them free. And so slavery in the ancient Near East was not like American slavery. The Apostle Paul addresses this question since a third to more than a third of the peoples of ancient Near Eastern times were slaves. He wants to speak to this master-slave relationship. And in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 5, he says this, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh." Be obedient. The responsibility of a slave is to obey the master. And the principle is that if we are in a contractual relationship with somebody, in a work relationship with somebody, then we ought to obey and follow the instructions that they give us. Now, of course, we know today things have become so complicated that we have problems like whistleblower laws to protect those. We are not to violate the laws of God nor the laws of the land in obedience, but there's a general principle in a working relationship, and that is that subordinates need to work with those in authority over them. Be obedient to those, he says, who are your masters, and then he has to put this little phrase in there, according to the flesh. The reason is that the word masters in the Greek text is kyrios, which is also translated Lord. And the Apostle Paul has been talking about children obeying their parents in the Lord, husbands and wives submitting to each other in the Lord. And so he needs to make the point here. He doesn't want to simply say, be obedient to your Lord, or these Christian slaves would say, well, I'm obedient to Christ. But he's saying, be obedient to your Lord, the one in the flesh, or according to the flesh, your earthly or your human master. Be obedient to those who are your human masters, and do it with fear and trembling. The word fear means exactly that. It is a sense or an emotion of endangerment or threat that could come upon you. Trembling represents the physical reaction to problems or threat or danger. And in ancient Near Eastern history, slaves did not have rights. And masters could be brutal, and they were brutal at times. And they were very hard at times. Generally speaking, not. For a slave was an employee, and you wanted the employee to succeed so that you would succeed. You wanted a good working relationship. so that you could prosper. But as a slave to a master, you needed a bit of fear. You needed a bit of trembling because they did have sovereign rule over you. Be obedient to your masters according to the flesh with fear and trembling. He says, in sincerity of your heart as to Christ. The word sincerity could be translated simplicity or even uprightness. The English scholar Ernest Best says it means purity of intention and dedication. Paul is commanding the slaves, be dedicated to your work. Have a purity of motive to your work. The antonym, or the opposite of this word, was one who was cunning, was crafty, who was wicked. And just like today, employees or slaves would take advantage of their masters. They would go to the market to sell something, and they would say, well, you give me this price above the table and this under the table. We have the wonderful story of Onesimus in the book of Philemon. Onesimus, who apparently either ran away from Philemon or who was sent off on a business deal and kept the money and squandered the money and caused Philemon some serious financial damage. Paul says, as Christian slaves, you are to work with a purity of intention and dedication from your heart, just as you were serving Christ. And ultimately, that's who we are serving. It's hard to serve employers or bosses or corporations at times. We sacrifice ourselves for their selfishness very often. We see that today in American culture, the CEOs getting millions and millions of dollars of bonuses off the sweat and labor of the workers, and that can be very discouraging. I remember as a young apprentice plumber, you know, when we were working hard and the owner was making some money, he would come out and he'd occasionally buy us some donuts at break time, or bring out some sandwiches at lunch, or bring out some refreshments on a hot day. And then he started making real money. And you think we'd have gotten the buffet. But no, he got more greedy. And he tried squeezing for more and more and more. And there was like no end to it. And you got discouraged. And so Paul says, look, you've got to look beyond that. And you've got to look to ultimately who you're serving. And that's the Lord Jesus Christ. And there are times when it is so discouraging to work for someone or something, and you just have to block that all out. And you have to say, you know what? Work is worship. Remember in the garden, God created the garden, created Adam and Eve, and he set Adam and Eve in the garden to work. Work is part of creative order. It's part of fulfillment in life. And a job well done is good for the soul. And very often you have to look beyond those that you're working for on earth and look to heaven and say, you know what? I'm going to glorify God through doing good work. And Paul says, look, do it with sincerity in your heart as to Christ. In verse 6, he says, look, not by way of eye service. The word eye service represents that which is performed only to make an impression in the owner's presence. And not as a man-pleaser, one who is trying to impress another in a false or deceptive way. Now, I can remember, again, going back to the days when I was in the trades, we'd be working away, and you'd have 3 or 4 guys just, sitting around doing nothing. And, I was an apprentice. It wasn't for me to say anything or do anything. But all of a sudden, you'd hear the scrambling going on. I mean, it was like mice or animals running through a room. and they were picking up tools, and everything got noisy. Man, every power tool in the place was buzzing. Now, it took me a couple times to understand this phenomenon, but somebody saw the boss's truck pull onto the job site. And so all of a sudden, everybody was going to get real busy and appear real busy. And as soon as the boss was gone, well, they sat down again. It's very easy to fall into a pattern of doing as little work as you have to. In fact, some people work very hard at it, doing nothing. And this can be irritating if you're in the trades we used to say, carrying them. But Paul says, look, don't serve with eye service, simply to make an impression. Now, somebody comes to my mind when I think of this word. Those of you who watch Nickelodeon or go back far enough to know about Leave It to Beaver, you know who I'm talking about. That young man who wanted to always make a good impression. Hello, Mr. Cleaver. Hello, Mrs. Cleaver. Eddie Haskell. Remember Eddie? Eye service, men pleaser. And the only person he was fooling was himself. But we've all got people like that out at the job, don't we? Or something. People who just are seeking to please the boss. And we've got different terms for them, which we can't use in the pulpit. But they are just eye service. They only are busy and working when people are looking. And they are only seeking to play up, to kiss up, to be a man pleaser. And the Apostle Paul says that's wrong. That's wrong. It's not the work ethic of a Christian person. Verse 7, he says, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. And that's what we do. We are ultimately slaves of Christ in our service, in our work. And what we are contracted or commanded to do, we need to do as the will of God, and we need to do it from our hearts. We worship on Sunday morning when we sing, but Monday through Friday we worship the Lord by doing our work according to His will, to His glory, to reflect our Christian faith. Verse 7, he says, render it with good will. With good will, render service as to the Lord and not to men. The word goodwill means a benevolence, a favor. It's showing a relationship of a good attitude and a willingness to work and participate as we are supposed to. And that goodwill is not going to come if we focus on the corporation or our manager or our boss alone. It must rise above that, and it must focus on the fact that ultimately here I am serving the Lord. Working for people and or corporations, as I said, can be very discouraging. We sacrifice for their selfishness. And if that is what we look at, work will be a bummer. And it will drag. We need to have goodwill. Verse 8, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether a slave or whether free. Ultimately, in every activity of our life, God is watching, and God will in some way, maybe not on earth, but certainly in eternity, He will reward us. He will render back to us what we are owed for the service that we have done. And Paul says, that's whether you're a slave worker or you're a free worker. God will reward you for whatever good thing you do, whatever it is that you find to do. Now, I want to pause again to just encourage those who are graduating. Whether you're graduating from high school or graduating from college or whatever, let me just say, find something in life that you like to do, and then do it to the glory of God. You're going to work for a long time in life. That's part of life. And you want to do what you enjoy doing. Don't do what pays the most money. Don't do what will, to you, be the quickest way to retirement. Because there is no quick way. I mean, you're looking at 40 years minimum. Look at something that you enjoy doing. Do it well. Get educated. And do it to the glory of God. And if you are working to the glory of God, the satisfaction to your soul and the satisfaction to the glory of God will be a great, great reward. Know this, that whatever good thing you do, God will recognize it and God will reward you. Many good works at work go unnoticed. Many people seek recognition and praise alone from their bosses. But those who do good works to the glory of God will be blessed of soul and blessed in eternity. Now in verse 9, the Apostle Paul turns to the masters. And he says, "And masters, do the same things to them." You masters are responsible to do the exact same things to the slaves that I've been talking to them about towards you. And what does that include? That includes they are to be obedient to the Lord. Masters are to obey the Lord. Masters are to show goodwill to their slaves. Masters are to have sincere, caring, goodwill motives towards their slaves. And he says, give up threatening. Now, there was a proverbial saying back then, all slaves are enemies. In any proverbial saying, there's got to be some real truth to it. And there was this kind of animosity or constant conflict between master and slave. And it was summarized in the statement that all slaves are enemies. Again, I remember when I was in the plumbing trade, one of the corporations would put on the fixtures that came out, and it said, people are paid only enough that they will not quit, and they work hard enough, only hard enough, so that they will not be fired. That's a terrible balance of power for prosperity. In ancient Near Eastern history, there was very common to threaten, and the threats were real. They would threaten them with beatings. They would threaten women with sexual harassment. They would threaten them with being sold and separated from their family. And negative reinforcement is not the best way to build a relationship, whether it's employer, employee, or parent-child, or whatever. Now, negative reinforcement has to be part of the dynamic, but positive reinforcement builds a relationship also. And it was common in ancient Near Eastern history for masters to go on with threats and threats and threats, and very often not to deliver. And understand this, the longer time between your threat and the deliverance of the consequences, the longer the person learns to wait. And you need to bring those together. Don't threaten somebody, just do it. Let the consequences fall if they need to. But he says, give up those threatenings. Why? Knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven. And there is no partiality with him. See, when God looks down from heaven, he doesn't see masters and slaves. He doesn't see employers and employees. He doesn't see people on different levels. He has no partiality. We are all servants or slaves to him. And therefore, we will all be judged on the same level. So, masters, you have a master. And you better understand this. Your master is watching how you are mastering your slaves. If you're in a management position, or you're an employer or something, you need to take this to heart. For you are representing God also on earth through your management and through your service. We all, as Christians, have one master who is in heaven, and he shall impartially judge each and every one of us. Now, before I close, I want to just answer the question, or at least address the question briefly. Why didn't Paul just preach against slavery in ancient Near Eastern history? Some people, again, coming from an American cultural, European imported basis of slavery and looking at the cruelty of that, why didn't Paul preach out against slavery? Well, first of all, again, the slavery of American history was not the slavery of ancient Near Eastern history. Secondly, the Apostle Paul, his focus was on eternity. He called both masters and slaves to Christian conduct, to Christian responsibility, and his main concern was not how does this impact earth now, but how does it impact heaven. He knew the big picture, and the big picture was you need to focus on heaven. Secondly, remember that slavery was a means of employment in ancient Near Eastern history. And the Apostle Paul, as well as all believers, was called to obedience to government. And the slavery of ancient Near Eastern history was part of government laws and rules and regulations. And to speak out against slavery would have been to have rebelled against the government and to have thrown away the message of Jesus Christ, to be confused with a message of rebellion. Finally, can you imagine the mass chaos that would have resulted if Christian slaves or all slaves began to rebel and suggest that they weren't going to work or they weren't going to be good citizens in society? And can you imagine the spiritual chaos that would have resulted if all of a sudden within the church Paul is teaching the rebellion and the disobedience of slaves and that all slaves were to be freed? Why, you'd have mass conversions, wouldn't you? Every slave would say, "Here am I, send me, Lord." And there probably been a confusion of the acceptance or the motivation for trusting in Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul in this passage calls us to work to the glory of God. Whether you're a master, a slave, an employer, or an employee, whether you're management, white collar, blue collar, or whatever, we are to work for the glory of God. Every believer in Jesus Christ should have an excellent work ethic so that we will accomplish our employment responsibilities. And I'll just throw this out. You don't learn a work ethic in your late 20s and your early 30s and so on and forth. You learn your work ethic in grade school, middle school, and in your teens. That's when you learn the responsibility of good work, of pitching in, of helping out, and of the satisfaction of accomplishing a good work. We should treat everyone at work with a gracious and loving attitude as believers in Jesus Christ.